Good morning, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just want to do this quick video that focuses mostly on some of the American history content that was in the HOTA text just to help you prepare for Friday. You can go back to the text to look at some of the content, especially if it is new for you and you didn't spend as much time on some of those topics last year. But for the most part, use some of the American history content as a way to help you compare and contrast some key elements of the new states post-independence in Latin America versus the United States. So if you're looking to compare and contrast them, and just keep in mind that we have a difference in the timeline, the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation and some of the stuff that we'll be addressing in this video really is part of the post-Revolutionary War context for the United States. So we're talking like 1770s, 1780s, by the time the Constitution gets created and then ratified. But in Latin America, we don't see the independence movements until really the 1810s, 1820s. So it's really beyond the time of the War of 1812 that we actually see the beginnings of states in Latin America. So just keep in mind that there is a difference in the in the timeline. The American Revolution is first. The kind of independence movement slash post-independence movement is happening, much earlier in the United States. But both kind of continents, if you will, do really address this kind of question of how much to centralize and what the government should look like, post-colonialism. And in the case of the United States, we have a much smaller United States at the time, 13 colonies that fight collectively against Britain and then ultimately create a government system. Even though the Articles of Confederation kind of kick things off before we have the Constitution, there still is an element where all of the colonies are sort of organized collectively. They've made some collaborative decisions based on delegates from the various colonies. We see much more fragmentation in Latin America. So if you consider, say, Mexico or South America, we get, increased divisions of society. So Guatemala, for example, will break away from Mexico, first as Central America, then as Guatemala. But we also have a great deal of, challenges to collaboration. Some of those are geographic. So, it's massive space. You have lots of mountain ranges and rivers and various things. And, some really significant divisions between rural and city folks, for example, that make it much more challenging to work collaboratively. So a lot of what we see in Latin America is kind of, nation building slash civil wars. The independence movements had that element of civil wars. So there's a great deal of like instability in Latin America. Maybe we see something arguably a little different in North America. So this question of like how to centralize, when we look at Latin America with this idea of like how much to centralize, kind of keep in mind that centralization in the Latin American context can mean a few different things. In some spaces, you might have a conservative caudillo who comes to play, who argues that, really rule under one individual with less kind of constitutional or parliamentary, types of limitations on powers. So sometimes centralization can mean that, some type of caudillo power. Sometimes centralization can really mean one particular dominance of a city. And, a good example of this would be in Argentina, where the centralists or the folks who are really under kind of the unitary idea of like one government start to see the dominance of Buenos Aires being really the kind of lead space where everything that's good for that city is good for Argentina. And people who don't think that become, kind of the anti-centralists. And in the Latin American context, these are called the federalists. So in the Latin American context, the federalists are not the folks seeking to centralize. They're the folks seeking that there should be some sort of division of political entities that collectively rule so that there isn't dominance of one particular city or individual, right? Whereas centralists kind of feel very differently. We'll look at a different kind of debate in the American context, American Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. But just keep in mind that a lot of the post-colonial debate in Latin America is about this dynamic. Some of this is about liberalism and conservatism, those Enlightenment values versus those who oppose them. So we have that going on in Latin America, but at the same time that's happening, you also have kind of another place where there's a clash, and that has to do with how much centralization there should be. So it's kind of a common question. If we look at the idea of some of the big differences, and as you read the Hoda text, some things to look for, there's a couple of other places where it seems natural to compare and contrast, South America, with North America. One has to do with the element of classes, the way in which various classes tend to develop. Lots of people would argue, and we see this in the Asimoglu text, that within American society, North American society, the United States, there becomes more opportunities for more people because any property owners are able to participate in having their property protected. And while there is an upper class, and we're going to see class issues really develop, and the Constitution, in a sense, maybe arguably comes to protect some of those upper classes, the moneyed classes, the New England bankers, and things like that. We definitely get a farmer class versus a banker class in the United States. But arguably, there's also a little bit more individual kind of social mobility, at least for some groups. And excluded from this, of course, will be indigenous peoples who are completely excluded from the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And then persons who are enslaved have a completely different set of circumstances and a complete lack of rights. In the case of the situation for the Latin America, we certainly see many more of the masses held to really challenging circumstances without the ability to access property. The kind of distinction between the highest classes and those who are the masses is really, really distinct in South America. At the same time, in both situations, you could make a case that there is not necessarily a great deal of change in the classes as a result of the Revolutionary War. There had been some social mobility for some groups prior to the American Revolution, and there had been some degree of, social mobility for Creoles, for example, at least in an economic sense. There's some changes in class, but your overall hierarchy to some degree doesn't necessarily massively change, and that's maybe dependent on where you are in the map, but people who are enslaved before the American Revolution are still enslaved after the American Revolution, and so on, maybe to some degree. In the case of religion, I think the biggest takeaway is that in Latin America, we see a much stronger role for the Roman Catholic Church, especially amongst the group of people who identify themselves as conservatives. There becomes very much a anti-secular type of frame and a much greater kind of highlight toward Roman Catholicism. In North America, we see some, there had been religious communities, like the Puritans, for example. Some of the colonies become quite exclusive in terms of religious belief, but you also had a great deal of, variety of religions. So you have lots of discussions about religious freedom, and one of the elements of what comes to pass in the Constitution Constitution and in the Bill of Rights is protection of freedom of religion, whereas we see the Catholic Church become kind of embedded as a dominant church in quite a few of the constitutions in South America. And a lot of that is because there is a catering to conservatives for that particular idea. In terms of slavery, I think for the most part, widespread, we don't see a great deal of freedom for those who are enslaved. You could make a case that in South America, there are some societies that do take very seriously the Enlightenment value of abolitionism and do quickly reduce slavery. We see that in a couple of places on the map. One of those places would be Mexico. Of course, Haiti is an example of that, but Mexico becomes a place where enslavement ends pretty early, and as noted in the text, like the Graham text, where slavery had fewer numbers, right, where it was less dominant, we tend to see it end earlier than in places like Brazil or Cuba or even the southern United States, because those are spaces where you have a great deal of enslavement and dependence on slavery for economic gain. So, those are some things to look at, right? So, sometimes with these types of discussions, it's, like what's going on in Latin America, what's going on in the United States, and where might there be nuance within that argument. It's not always as easy as, slavery was, eradicated or not. There's a lot more of an it depends. We see that in North America as well. After the Declaration of Independence, we see northern states in the United States start to disband slavery and start to make it gradually gradually emancipate enslaved persons. New Jersey will be the last state in the North to do that in 1804. But there's certainly a continuation of slavery in the South. So the slave trade will stop, and the slavery in some of the northern states like Massachusetts will stop, but you won't see slavery in the South, of course, until we see the Civil War. And then that question of centralization and federalism, there are in both continents, really big questions about how much central government should kind of rule and how important it is to have a centralized government. Certainly, it creates a great deal more order. So conservatives, tend to be more favored the stronger the central government is. At the other hand, you also have this argument that maybe liberals make that individual rights should be protected by the government, and ultimately there should be a great deal of diverse kind of points of view that get represented, and it shouldn't really come down to what was in place prior to independence, of course, was a monarch. So we see lots of hesitancy in some circles before moving toward the creation generally of like an autocratic ruler. That's something that generally gets avoided. In the case of South America, we're more likely to see that in some places, even if it's argued to be temporary, because some of this is about the value of order in a society that seemed to be a little bit more chaotic. So look carefully at those questions as you read the Hoda text. And then we'll just talk briefly about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, just so you have some of that content in your back pocket. I think I noted this in the study guide for the quiz on Friday. You do not need to prepare for the War of 1812. We're just going to take that off of the quiz for Friday and attach that to a topic we'll look at next week. This way you can kind of focus on the nation building through some of the constitution building. We see constitutions in both, North America and South America, many more in South America because there's consistent changes to constitutions and redos of constitutions or ignoring of constitutions. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. But I'm going to stop the video here so I can do a second part about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Just to note, if you happen to be a fan of kind of interesting history classes. There is a Yale open course right now that focuses on the founding of the United States because it's really connected to the 250th anniversary and whatnot. And the professor at Yale, Joanne Freeman, who is really, really good. And she is a professor of early American history. She does a really nice chat about the Articles of Confederation, about the Constitution. I will put the link in case you want to extend some of your knowledge on those topics.